The Beat generation was best defined by Allen Ginsberg in 1958 as strictly a literary scene, basically, with technical literary practical meanings, shifts in prosody of verse, and experiments and progress in prose forms. Most of the sociological generalizations and middle class publicity discussions, what does beat mean? Is it positive or negative? Why do they steal hubcaps? Are false issues created by journalistic minds, hung up with meaningless habitual categories that just do not fit and never have been the concern of artistic or spiritual creation, i.e., square. Beat is a poetic conception, an attitude toward the world. The Beat movement, also called the Beat Generation, was an American social and literary movement that originated in the 1940s through 1950s following the end of World War II. It was centered in the bohemian artist communities of LA, New York City, and San Francisco, which was the heart of the movement. It was self-styled as beat, which originally meant weary, but later also had a musical connotation, generally meaning a beatific spirituality. Derisively, they were also called beatniks. This name expressed their questioning of mainstream politics and culture, and their defiance and ultimate alienation of the conventional, or square, society by adopting the style of dress, manner, and vocabulary that they had borrowed from jazz musicians. Beat poets often sought to transform their poetry into an expression of what was considered to be a genuine and authentically raw lived experience. Their work was usually read aloud with the accompaniment of music. The verse was frequently chaotic and liberally sprinkled with obscenities and blatant references to sex, all intended to liberate poetry from fastidious academic refinement. Writers advocated for personal release, illumination, purification, and achieving higher consciousness through heightened sensory awareness and experiences, which might be induced by jazz, sex, hallucinogenic drugs, or the disciplines of Eastern religions, such as Zen Buddhism, which many of the poets practiced. The Beats and their advocates found the joylessness and the purposelessness of modern society to be sufficient justification for both withdrawal and protest. Unlike many of their literary predecessors, the writers in the Beat generation generally had no shared styles, philosophies, or aims. The three most notable poets who have been said to define the generation were Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, and Jack Kerouac, who is said to have coined the term Beat generation when describing the down-and-out status of himself and those around him during these post-war years. However, three writers does not a generation make, as writers such as Gary Snyder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Anne Waldman, Gregory Corso, Kenneth Rexroth, and Diane di Prima, just to name a few, were also among some of the most important figures of the movement. During the 1960s, the Beat movement had begun to evolve and inevitably fade, though its influence, such as its experiments with form and its social and cultural engagement, continued and had lasting effects, even through today. Many notable music artists cite the Beat movement as their inspiration, including Bob Dylan, Elvis Presley, the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, the Doors, and Velvet Underground. The movement also produced a significant number of important writers and paved the way for the broader acceptance of other marginalized and even often ignored subjects and writers, like the Black Mountain Poets. The aims of the Beat movement are still prominent today through its criticisms of politics and the military, its influence on the music industry, and the rise of spiritual, cultural, and sexual revolution and liberation.
Okay, moving on to part 2, the critical piece of writing for our poetic school. So for the Black Mountain Poets, I have chosen the essay Some Notes on Organic Form by Denise Levertov. Not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but I believe it is a very insightful essay given Denise Levertov's place in the movement itself. She was published alongside Larry Eigner, Paul Blackburn, in the Black Mountain Review, even though she never actually went to the Black Mountain College. The essay was first published in 1965 in Poetry. And what it essentially does is it primarily draws the distinction between received forms and organic forms. She bases this idea on Robert Creeley's ideas. These ideas in discussion with Charles Olson were sort of the genesis of the Black Mountain poetry movement itself. So he talks about, this is Robert Creeley, he talks about form as never being more than an extension of content. We can sort of think of this like the old adage, the medium is the message. The idea being that what is being created or conveyed will always owe something to or be influenced by that form with which it through which it is being created. And so when we look at the distinction between organic form and received form, the distinction there is essentially that received form is where the form is fixed and the content must fit to the form. Again, more going in line with the medium is the message. Whereas in organic forms, the form, again, this is sort of paraphrasing Creeley, the form is never more than a revelation of content. The idea there being that essentially the poem is breaking outside the restraints of the form itself. It's trying to think, how can I use rhythm? How can I use language? How can I use what is at my disposal to create something that is in of itself what it is, and not just something that could only have been made in this form. Levertov also draws a distinction between free verse and organic form, stating that free verse is essentially a failed version of organic form. A more important sort of distinction being that free verse pays much more attention and is much more conscious of each individual line of a poem and its effect in that sense, or perhaps just a couplet of lines, whereas in organic form, the all-encompassing effect of the poem is paid attention to, so that you're thinking about not just each line and what each line means, but how each line works in the context of the poem, looking at how each individual piece makes up the whole. It's essentially a way to step back and say, how can we look at this poem as a whole and not just these individual lines? These sort of idea of the organic form is shaping awareness and perception of the poem set in the verbal world. So again, using the sort of tools you have at your disposal while still thinking, how can I make something that, can project past that. That's something in projective verse. That's another Charles Olson. And when we apply that to, if we apply this idea to, how this idea still influences poetry, is it still relevant? I think that's absolutely still relevant. A lot of our discussions in class have been about the form of poetry itself and how we can think of poetry in itself as, certain forms, certain ways of perceiving, how they're influenced by experience, whether or not they can totally be subjective, whether or not they can obtain those objective truths. That doesn't really quite play into the different forms, but it can certainly be an aspect of it, because in discussing form, we are also discussing poetry as a movement, as an art form in itself, and sort of analyzing what makes it different from other art forms, and what is the greatest potential of poetry. And the potential of poetry is really what the forms are about. So I think for that reason, it'll probably always be at least somewhat relevant to modern or contemporary poetry. All right.
I will be discussing about two authors from the Beats movement. First will be Burning Island by Gary Snyder. Burning Island is an excellent example of a poem representing the Beats movement. Snyder utilizes his platform as a poet to enlighten people's perception of literary tradition, along with Eastern-based theology and connections to nature. Specifically with Burning Island, we see that there are key factors that are contributing to this movement. To start, the title itself gives the image of an island that is burning. An island is described as a piece of land which stands alone, separated from a continent, and surrounded by water. The title helps us to get a visual of a violent eruption taking place in a single but separated piece of land. Snyder goes on to describe how the island was created from a volcanic belly keeper who lifted this island for our own beaded bodies, adornment, and sprinkles us all with his laugh. Snyder is challenging some of the basic rules of literary tradition. Literary tradition can be characterized by a style of writing that is often passed down generations and are meant to describe mainly worldly topics. Burning Island was written in free verse with stanzas, varying in length in comparison to the previous era of poetry, which mainly focused on strict rhyme schemes and formats. The poem includes various types of gods, including the wave god, the volcano belly keeper, sky gods, and Buddha. Snyder is not sticking to the themes that may be common amongst poems by doing this. There are other clear contributions from the beats found in the poem, with high influences from Eastern religion, ecological concerns over nature, and the world. The American Way by Gregory Corso. Gregory Corso's poem The American Way has powerful and anti-political themes related to the Beats movement. The title instantly gives an introduction to what the ingredients will be to the poem. The American Way has a centralized theme of Americans being brainwashed and leading to the destruction of America. In relation to the Beats movement, Corso's poem uses skills to create a masterpiece of insight into his mind, displaying examples of anti-politics and education. His critiques of the American government, how the Declaration of Independence is no longer relevant, and the commercialization of religion are some examples of this. There is a repetition of what he calls the way. What the way means to Corso is the American way, which is togetherness. Togetherness is what he describes as replica production. In other words, he feels that the social conformity that is being embedded into the American minds from the time that they are born, with the use of institutions like school, religion, government, and the military. There is no surprise that Corso would write so passionately in opposition of these institutions, because the Beats movement was created soon after the end of World War II, which was protested against anti-war movements. He also says that if Abraham Lincoln were to run for president today, that he would not be elected merely because of his looks. The American way is described as monstrous, and that Americans see this type of life as a good life, because the men who are employed by this monster are employed unknowingly. The Beats authors were also very critical of culture, which Corso mentions that Hollywood is full of goofs of show business. Show business is focused on luxurious and romanticizing events rather than truthful and meaningful concepts. The Beats authors were known to seek changing consciousness, and Corso was able to do this with concluding his poem by saying that the only way out of the way is through a new consciousness. Thank you.
Now on to question 4. The living poet is C.A. Conrad. Beats poets rebelled against contemporary forms of poetry. Each poet in this movement shielded themselves from mainstream poetry. Instead, they wrote to jazz tempos and rhythms where their stanzas flowed with long and languid lines to accentuate their thoughts. In addition, Beats poets used cultural and political themes to outline their generational voice. C.A. Conrad, pronouns are they, them, is a poet influenced by inner and outer self. Upon research, I've come to believe that Conrad is a psychogeography poet. The term psychogeography poetry means studying the effects of a specific environment. The poet writes about individuality outside of government or large businesses. In essence, the poet, like Conrad, seeks to give back to the arts. They give back to the Beats movement by drifting in and out of consciousness to explore what inhibits poetry and how thoughts collectively rely on emotions and behaviors. The deep involvement of Beats poets like Allen Ginsberg means how they reacted to their environment, how their environment reacted to their poetry. Ginsberg's poems can be evaluated by a man who is wandering through freedom of mind and freedom of expression. Basically, he had a lot of feelings seeking to be expressed. He was softened by his art. He was smoothed out by life's hard edges with tender notes of jazz rhythm. Because we understand that contemporary poets are influenced by their predecessor, Conrad's approach to poetry, according to Poetry Foundation, focuses on the process and on engaging a permeability of the border between self and other. I find Conrad's self and other are themselves versus the nature. They are a system of nature within a system of government and politics, and Conrad's poetry claims their existence to push linguistic values and boundaries that can't be rejected, which is how Conrad understands how Ginsberg wrote from a place that elevated expression and freedom in eco-criticism form. Conrad once said, "As an American poet in the best sense, is resisting a hostile American government which is as imperialistic as ever, destroying the millions of lives around the world." Conrad's poem, Altered After Too Many Years Under the Mask, exemplifies how psychogeography poets think about their response to numerous surroundings. He writes, "Soon, no mitigation of wild animals will be unknown to humans. We will chart, film, record, publish, archive everything. It gives us something to do while we annihilate beauty, poets, shoveling a quarry that is ongoing." Conrad's work is raw and honest, which reminds me of Ginsberg's. Both poets understand emotional vulnerability. The inspiration of a predecessor becomes the influence that rejects materialism to heighten a poet's mind and body. Cultural influences define how they disengage from politics towards psychogeography and ecological discourse. As I focus on Ginsberg and Conrad, I would like to note in 2006, Publishers Weekly reviewed Conrad's work and stated, though he invokes celebrities and poetic mentors like Robert Creeley and Kevin Killen and Courtney Love, the best analogy for the Philadelphia-based Conrad is Allen Ginsberg, who also shocked America with his frankness, denounced hypocrisy in prose poems and in verse declamation, and who also hoped to embody queer life of his times. Like Ginsberg, C.A. Conrad goes against the grain of traditional poetry. Both poets fluctuate between concrete and abstract that begins to take their poetry back to concrete, and it creates a narrative in their own right. Ginsberg and Conrad's work doesn't judge, it just engages the senses. It's wrapped in imagination to their human relationship and ecological reference to nature. To answer the question, what do you see as the legacy of the poetic school or movement in this poet's work? I've come to find out that Ginsberg, he basically is like one of the main ones that created the Beats movement. So he is the legacy. He is the one that's most talked about. His poems are the ones that are most studied, especially Howl. So I think that Ginsberg and the Beat movement's legacy on C.A. Conrad's work indicates they felt the difference between traditional and free-spirited poetry through rhythm and beat. Poets within this movement sought to open themselves through poetic verse in a time when traditionalism is still held firm in society. I like to think that C.A. Conrad writes from a place where nothing is left behind and everything is open for discussion, as he continues to search for inclusivity among a life that doesn't value him as a person. Unfortunately, this is a legacy that Ginsberg left behind as well. In Howl, he sought personal freedom and breaking out of societal norms, especially queer poets who sought to balance taboo concepts that were marginalized for their time. While Conrad lives in a time where things aren't as taboo, I think that this had helped him become who he is because he was influenced by how open Ginsberg was. Conrad's poem focuses and forces people to pay attention because he believes that mass culture has influenced people to hide behind screens rather than pay attention to culture and ecological awareness. Poetic art forms come from within, which is a vital key ingredient for how they use poetry as a form of art and courage. The godfather of the Beats movement, Ginsberg, forged for new poetic territory, not only for himself but for others, thus aiding Conrad to have imagination and social output in the form that has given him courage and expression, and just for him just to be who he is. Lastly, poets like Conrad are educated from earlier poets and movements. Still, they go beyond their predecessors into their own free verse and vague ideas overpowered by stream of consciousness. Conrad's techniques make the views of their world have energetic volume that reflects their attitudes and artistic value through various themes. Thank you.